Hey everybody, Joe Casabona here. I thought I would try something a little bit different. This is inspired by Jimmy's Three Things from John Boy, but I thought I would try to do a weekly stream slash podcast series called Three Things in Podcasting. I'm certainly not the first person to think of this or do this, but I thought it would be fun. And so there were three news items that kind of came up that I thought would be interesting to cover. And so I want to cover them here. The first one is a question that Danny Brown posed on various writing websites, but I saw it on Substack. I saw it through Pod News. So shout out to Pod News. And it's three things I do differently if I started podcasting today. So I really like this question. It's something I think about all the time because I think that, if you're a longtime podcaster, you could fall into the trap of doing or recommending things that worked at one time but no longer work. And so it's really nice to do this kind of me-focused retrospective of like, here's what I did that I'd want to do differently. He says I would have a plan. It basically, this is something that I think a lot of first-time podcasters fall into the trouble of. I'm really good at talking with my friends, and so I'll just talk for a while. And so he said the first thing he would do is have a plan. Number two, he wouldn't sweat the numbers. This is so important, especially starting out. Like, it feels like you're just shouting into the void. Fully agree with that. Don't worry about the downloads at first. Just worry about making good content. And number three, he says he would have learned how to edit. This was something that I knew from the beginning I didn't want to do. I edited the first couple of episodes and I thought, if I want this to be a real actual investment, I need to hire an editor. And so I found an editor. So I would strongly recommend this. It's linked in the description and in the show notes, depending on where you're viewing this. So he also said, your turn. What are three mistakes you made? And so I jumped into the comments and I added my thoughts here. So I said, fantastic post, +1 on editing. That's something I did early on that contributed. For me, the three things that I would do differently are I would have transcripts from the beginning, right? And so what's going on here? Oh, my Stream Deck buttons aren't working. I guess I'll have to edit this part out. There we go. So number one is I would have transcripts from the beginning. I probably waited about 100 episodes in to get them, and I ended up going back and paying for the back catalog. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, they're a huge boon for accessibility. They're really important for accessibility. And they contributed to the success of my show. I saw a direct correlation between when I added transcripts and the increase in my listenership, my downloads, people joining my mailing list. So I ended up paying for the first 100 or so after the fact, and that was a big expense. It was worth it, but maybe my show would have grown a little faster if I had transcripts. And of course, that was in 2016 before AI transcripts were a thing. And so now it's even easier, and I would say even more important to have those transcripts. Number two, I wouldn't ask the same question to every guest or the same set of questions. I always ask the same 5 questions. Who are you and what do you do? Tell us about your product. Tell us about your first failure. How did you build it? Do you have any trade secrets for us? And I thought this was like super clever, like very clear format. But it gets stale after a while. Imagine if I was still doing that 400 plus episodes in, it would be pretty boring. It wouldn't be compelling content. That's like, that's like a blog post, right? And so I wouldn't do that every time. And that leads right into the third thing I would do differently, which is I would do more research on guests. I'm on record as saying I want to be surprised along with my listeners. And I realize now that was just laziness on my part, right? I didn't want to do the research. I didn't want to put the extra time in. And so you can't create a good story if you don't know the story beats, right? It's like saying, oh, I'm going to drive to this place, but I'm not going to look up how to drive there. I'm just going to drive around until I find it. That's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of money. And it's the same thing with not doing research on your guests. I'm not saying you need to make it like a deeply researched profile, but know the things you want to cover and have some semblance of the answers that the guest is going to give so that you can lead them down the path that you want them to take your listeners. I think that's really important, and that's definitely something I would do differently. Okay, so the next thing is, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and I really haven't been able to put into words how to best describe it, I guess. And Neil Veglio, OG podcaster, lots of strong opinions I really appreciate. He, I think, does a really good job on Twitter or X of talking about Spotify for podcasters. And I guess this was based on, I haven't listened to the episode yet. Neil's in the UK, and so he got the jump on Sam and James Pod News episode this week, which is also in the UK. So, they talk about the lack of differential between Anchor, quote unquote, which is Spotify for podcasters, and other paid hosts. So he does a really good job of breaking this down, and I'm just going to kind of cover the high level stuff. It's not a very long thread, but I do want to mention them. There's very little difference between listening experience, right? So like if you're hosting on Spotify for podcasters versus he says Captivate, I would say rss.com. Your listeners are probably not going to know the difference, especially if they're listening in an app of their choice, right? Maybe they'll see a difference if they visit the podcast's website, right? Some podcast hosts have a better website experience than others, but there's very little in the sound quality, right? But there's a huge difference, he says, in terms of the creator, of you, the podcaster, right? Features, uptime, data, UX, and tech innovation. This is really important because Spotify has proved that they are willing to just capriciously kill things, right? It is a free product for them. And just like Google has a graveyard full of free products, because Spotify for podcasters is not a direct generator for them, they are willing to make changes to it in order to make it more profitable, right? The same thing is with Google, right? With Android, I think it was Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google, said Android is a drop in the bucket as far as our revenue. Like Android could disappear tomorrow. And this is a few years ago now, so maybe it's different, but I doubt it's different. Android could disappear tomorrow and it wouldn't affect our bottom line. I don't know that Spotify would say that about their hosting, like their free hosting arm, but it's definitely not the streaming subscriptions, and it's definitely not Megaphone. So, you need to worry about that, right? And then he says in the next point, right? Like there was really sketchy terms for Anchor around IP, right? Around your content, and zero regards for privacy. Piracy was rampant. And so it was a blatant lack of customer care. And like he said, it's very opaque. Really, it was shady, right? This is the main thing that I would say to people in the beginning. I haven't used it in a while. The benefit of a paid host are accountability and innovation, right? This is if you're paid and their bottom line relies on making a good product, then they are encouraged to make a good product, right? Spotify, like I said, this is, or like he says, like Neil says, this is rented land. This is not for you. It's something for them to get more data and more content on the platform to make their money. They're not advocates of RSS, and they're doing proprietary 2.0. They want people to stay on Spotify. This is why they tried to get exclusivity with their biggest podcasts. That didn't work out for them, but it probably works out for smaller podcasters, right? Where they're encouraged to just stay on the platform and keep people on the platform. And like he says here, his last point, if Spotify for podcasters ever goes to the wall, always a possibility as it happens given their recent moves, there's always a risk of them taking podcasts down with them. We've heard horror stories of podcasters' income from Spotify for podcasters disappearing, right? The show is gone, the revenue is gone. And that's scary. And there's nothing you can do about it, right? If you're living in an apartment building and the guy who owns the apartment building decides to sell it and the buyers decide to knock it down, there's, in the United States at least, there's very little that you can do about that, right? At the very least, you have a very short timeline to find a new place to live, and that's going to upend your life, right? And so rented land is not great. Free products are rented land. So I really liked Neil's take on that. I think he describes things really succinctly, and I wanted to highlight that. The last thing of my 3 things in podcasting is Riverside introduced Video Dub this week. I love Riverside, and I am AI suspicious, right? And so they introduced Video Dub, no more endless retakes, re-records, and corrections. Correct your transcript, and Video Dub will use AI to make it look and sound like that's what you said in the first place. I would encourage you to watch the video. It is very impressive. Steven Robles does a really nice job of going through this. So the video is real impressive. That said, I'm suspicious of this. I'm suspicious of AI. And it worries me a little bit that this will be used as a crutch to make mediocre content to fix later, is maybe what it is. And like, sure, AI can come up with opinion, even though people try to write just using AI. I think it's very impressive technology. I guess I'm highlighting it here because I'll be curious to see how it's used and how it actually works in the real world, right? Because Descript has the overdub feature, and I don't know. I could tell it's not me. I don't know if other people can tell it's not me. I've used it in the past because like I've said like a sponsor's name wrong and I was away from my machine. And like in emergency situations, this is amazing, right? But if it's like, oh, I messed up this whole section and I don't feel like re-recording it, I'll just use this Video Dub feature. You know, I think like little fixes, it's probably fine and it's going to be a time saver. I fear that people are going to lean on it, just like there are people who are like, hey, you can write a book in 48 hours using AI. Like, yeah, it's going to be a pretty crappy book. So I just wanted to highlight that. Those are the 3 things. I do want to do one honorable mention, and I'll cover this more for RSS.com next week. But RSS.com, we're rolling out, or we're talking a lot about, I should say, live podcasting. And so we have it out now. I'll be doing a video on how to do this, and it's really exciting stuff. I'm live streaming right now. I think it's really a fun way to engage your listeners and create great content that maybe is a little bit less pressure. Like there's lower pressure for live streaming, right? When you live stream, people don't necessarily expect here we go. People don't necessarily expect that it's going to be super polished. And yeah, like when I roll this episode out, I'll edit out the middle part where I got really confused. But I'm really excited about this because it's another way to engage and interact with your listeners and create really good content. And like I said, I'll be covering it more next week for rss.com, but just shout out to rss.com. Because it's really exciting. Like live shows in the podcast feed for apps that support it is super neat. If you liked this, head over to podcastworkflows.com/join and subscribe to the show or join the mailing list. I'm going to try to make this a weekly thing. If not at least fortnightly. I'm sure there's always going to be like 3 things that I could talk about. I really like the format. And it's an interesting way for me to continue podcasting and adding stuff to the podcast workflows content library in a summer that's going to be really busy for me as I work on a bunch of pretty big projects, but I want to keep the ball rolling here. So if you like this, let me know, leave a comment on the video or reach out via email, joe@casabona.org, or on the podcast workflows contact page. Again, all of that's going to be at podcastworkflows.com/join. So thanks so much for listening. And until next time, I'll see you out there.